Never make a critical decision based on intuition. Intuition can be a valuable tool, but only if it's used in the right order. During my presentation on decision making, I often ask, who here would consider yourself to be a natural, intuitive decision maker and problem solver? Anybody? Well, invariably not a single hand is raised. I then ask, who here would like to be a natural, intuitive decision maker and problem solver? This time, almost everybody raises their hand. But here's the thing. We are natural, intuitive decision makers and problem solvers. And in our modern world, that's the problem. We consistently mistake feeling right with being right. See, intuition is so compelling when making decisions and solving problems because it causes us to feel right. But feeling right and being right are not at all related. See, we have been hardwired and programmed to rely on intuition. Over the eons of our evolutionary development, we have been hardwired to make decisions based on gut instincts and intuition. Now, this basic survival mechanism worked beautifully on the savannah, but in our modern world, it can lead to decisional disaster, and it usually does. Intuition is not a means of assessing complexity, but of ignoring it. The human brain craves certainty. Your brain senses uncertainty as a threat and a clear sign of danger. So we're constantly striving to get that feeling of being right. And nothing feels righter than our intuition. Now, let's suppose you've acquired a good deal of expertise in a particular field. Well, in that case, it may surprise you to know that using your intuition to make decisions within the field of your expertise will often result in a bad decision. And why is that? Because our intuition feels right. So we subconsciously neglect to bother applying logic, reason, and effortful thinking to support our decision. I mean, why bother? Now, don't get me wrong. Your hard-earned experience and intuition are of great value, but only if you use them in the correct sequence. Intuition, Daniel Kahneman's surprising discovery. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman shared a story about how he came to understand intuition, when it can be helpful, and when it will result in false confidence and irrationality. Many decades ago, Daniel Kahneman was serving in the psychology branch of the Israeli Defense Forces. In 1955, the commanding officers believed that each branch had its own personality. They believed that there was a fighter pilot type, an armored unit type, and an infantry type, and so on. So when new recruits were first interviewed, the commanders wanted to immediately determine in which branch each recruit was best suited. To solve this knotty problem, they turned to Daniel Kahneman, a 21-year-old lieutenant whose sole qualification was a BA in psychology. Looking back, Kahneman said, "I was no more qualified for the task than I was to build a bridge across the Amazon." But then again, in 1955, Israel was only 7 years old and virtually every system was being created from scratch. Now, at that time, the Defense Forces had an interview routine in place, but as the commanders readily acknowledged, it was next to useless. Back then, the interviewers, who were mostly women, were themselves draftees who were selected by virtue of their high intelligence and their interest in dealing with people. Now, these interviewers were given a 2-week crash course on how to conduct a 15 to 20-minute interview by covering a wide range of topics. Then, based on the recruit's response, they were to form a general impression of how well the recruit would do in the Army and then assign him to a particular branch. Well, Kahneman's task was to design an interview that would be more useful, but would not take up any more time. So he devised a procedure in which the interviewers would evaluate several relevant personality traits such as responsibility, sociability, masculine pride, and so on. Then, for each trait, the interviewers would ask a series of preset factual questions about the individual's life before his enlistment. Questions such as the number of jobs he had held, how regular and punctual he had been in his work and in his studies, the frequency of interaction with friends, and his interests and participation in sports, and so on. Now, the focus of the questions was not to determine what the interviewers thought of him, but rather to determine how he had actually behaved. See, Kahneman found that by focusing on standardized, factual questions, he could combat the halo effect, where first impressions would influence later judgments. Now, the interviewers were instructed to go through the 6 traits in a fixed sequence, rating each trait on a 5-point scale. Their job was to provide a reliable number and leave the predictive validity to the formula, and that was that. Well, to Kahneman's surprise, the interviewers came close to mutiny. They felt as though they were being ordered to turn off their intuition and function like robots. So Kahneman thought it might be best to compromise. So he told them to carry out the interview just exactly as he had instructed. But when finished, the interviewer was to close her eyes and try to imagine the recruit as a soldier 3 or 4 months from now. And using whatever formula or system they chose, they were to assign that recruit to the branch that they felt he was best suited. Well, a few months later, after several hundred interviews had been conducted using this method, the results showed that the sum of the 6 ratings predicted a soldier's performance much more accurately than the previous evaluations of the interview method. And then Kahneman found something most interesting, and that was the intuitive judgment that interviewers summoned in their close your eyes exercise. They performed just as well as the sum of his 6 specific ratings formula. In other words, they didn't know what Kahneman's numbers meant or how they applied to his evaluation, but they did learn something about evaluation by following his procedure. And from that revelation, Kahneman learned a valuable lesson that he's never forgotten. That lesson is this: do not trust intuitive judgment, your own or anyone else's, unless it is made by someone experienced in their area of concern, and only then if it follows a disciplined decision-making process. The process stood the test of time. The process Kahneman created proved so successful that the Israeli military has been using it up to the present. In his book, The Undoing Project, author Michael Lewis wrote, "The question the Israeli military had asked him, which personalities are best suited to which military roles, had turned out to make no sense. So Kahneman answered a different, more fruitful question. How do we prevent the intuition of interviewers from screwing up the assessment of Army recruits? Kahneman had been asked to divine the character of the nation's youth. Instead, he discovered something about people who try to divine other people's characters, remove their gut feelings, and their judgments improve. He'd been handed a narrow problem and discovered a broad truth. In Harvard Business Review, Eric Bonovo in Don't Trust Your Gut wrote, "The instinctive rush to apply a pattern to a phenomenon can also cut off or narrow an individual's or a group's thinking too quickly. Impatient with ambiguity, the mind naturally seeks closure that seems, in fact, to be one of the main functions of intuition. But an intelligent decision-making process," he wrote, "often requires the sustained exploration of many alternatives. You want to keep the process open as long as possible before converging on a final choice. And that's hard to do when your gut or your boss's gut is giving you the answer. When making important decisions, there's no such thing as a no-brainer. Every major decision is fraught with misperceptions, biases, and other tricks of the mind that, if left unchecked, they will have a profound influence on your choices, and you won't even know it. When you make a critical decision, intuition can complement a good decision, but it cannot replace a decision-making process. So, when you're confronted with an important decision, that is a nugget of information you don't ever want to forget. Below are some links. You can click on those for the 7 steps to the anatomy of a good decision.